Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're not wandering into glittering royal banquets or golden thrones. Instead, we're going underground, into the damp, echoing stone of medieval dungeons. Don't worry, this won't be grim in the loud, dramatic sense. No need for sharp violins or sudden shocks. We're going to take our time. This is a slow descent, step by step down the spiral staircase, where the air gets cooler and the torchlight flickers. So before we settle into that world, take a moment, dim the lights around you, maybe sip some water or tea, and make sure you're comfortable. If you're listening in bed, let your shoulders sink a little deeper into the pillow. Because tonight, we're talking about something both oddly practical and deeply unsettling. What medieval prisoners actually ate in castles and dungeons. And as you'll see, the answer is not very much, or sometimes far too much, because of course, even prison food depended on status. Noble captives dined like sulking aristocrats in slightly smaller rooms, while peasants often starved in corners, gnawing on things not even dogs wanted. Naturally, the Middle Ages had a flair for extremes.
Let's start with the basics. If you were unlucky enough to be thrown into a dungeon, and not the metaphorical kind, but a real one carved into the cold belly of a castle, your diet was not designed for pleasure. It was designed for survival, or sometimes for slow punishment. In other words, food wasn't there to keep you happy. It was there to remind you that you weren't free. The standard issue? Bread. But not the kind you're imagining, not a warm, crusty loaf from a rustic bakery. Prison bread was often so stale it could double as a weapon. Some accounts describe it as little more than baked grain husks mixed with bran, sometimes adulterated with dust, dirt, or whatever filler the jailer had on hand. It wasn't about taste. It was about bulk. Bread that sat like a stone in the stomach, making you feel full even if it wasn't nourishing much of anything. And then there was water. Except water in medieval dungeons didn't always mean crystal-clear mountain springs. It often meant the same stuff seeping through stone walls, green-tinged, murky, and occasionally sharing space with the waste runoff. So, to avoid poisoning the inmates too quickly, some jailers provided what was called prison ale. This wasn't the frothy tankard of tavern songs. It was a weak, thin beer, barely alcoholic, brewed cheap, but safer than raw water. It kept the prisoners alive just enough to keep them suffering.
Now, let's drift over to the way status warped the menu. Because if you were a noble prisoner, say a captured knight after a battle, you weren't exactly chewing on moldy crusts in the dark. In fact, nobles sometimes brought their own servants into captivity. Yes, that's right. Prisoners with rank were allowed to have staff who could cook, fetch food from markets, and essentially turn the cell into a private chamber with bad lighting. Take the case of Richard the Lionheart, captured in the late 12th century. His captivity was technically harsh. Ransom negotiations dragged on, and the whole of England felt the strain. But Richard himself? He dined better in prison than most of his subjects did at home. Fresh meats, spiced stews, fine wines, all brought in by loyal retainers. His prison diet looked less like punishment and more like a tedious, locked-in dinner party. Meanwhile, at the other end of the social ladder, common criminals sat in filth, chewing whatever could be tossed through a barred door. Some records even suggest that straw bedding doubled as storage for crusts of bread. A prisoner might dig into their bedding at night, not just for warmth, but to gnaw at the crumbs left behind. which is not exactly the glamorous medieval image we get from Hollywood.
There's also the curious practice of jail fees. Yes, prisoners were often expected to pay for their own upkeep. If you had money, you could bribe the jailer to bring better food, sometimes even hiring cooks to deliver hot meals daily. If you had no money, you relied on whatever scraps came in, sometimes begging family members to toss food through the bars. In other words, prison food wasn't a service, it was a business opportunity for the jailer. And jailers, naturally, took advantage. Historical complaints survive, where families accused prison keepers of skimming off half the food or selling donated bread in the market for profit. If a prisoner starved to death, well, it was rarely investigated. After all, they were prisoners. But let's not forget the extremes of cruelty. Starvation itself was sometimes the sentence. There's a phrase in medieval English law, peine forte et dure. It referred to crushing a prisoner with stones for refusing to plead. But in many cases, hard and forceful punishment also meant starving someone in solitary confinement until their bodies simply gave out. It wasn't just the absence of food. It was food used as a weapon. Each withheld crust became part of the execution. Of course, not every prisoner met that fate. Some lived for years in confinement, fed just enough to stay alive, existing in a twilight world of hunger. Imagine chewing the same dry bread day after day, sipping the same sour ale, never feeling full, never tasting anything bright or fresh. Your memories of roasted meat or sweet fruit would have been like dreams of another life. And yet, in the oddest twist, there are accounts of prisoners getting fat. Yes, fat in prison. How? Because nobles, again, lived in their own parallel universe. Their families often overcompensated, sending basket after basket of food to prove devotion. Roasted capons, candied fruits, honey cakes, enough to feed an entire household. And since there was little else to do in captivity but eat, complain, and occasionally plot escape, eating won. So we end up with this bizarre contrast. One prisoner chewing mold in the dark, another lounging on a feather mattress, unbuttoning his tunic after too much venison. Both, technically, imprisoned. Both living radically different versions of dungeon life. The emotional effect of food, or its absence, lingered too. Letters survive where prisoners begged for specific comforts. A wedge of cheese, a flask of good ale, a handful of almonds. Tiny luxuries that made the stone walls a little more bearable. And when those things didn't come, despair deepened. It wasn't just the hunger that broke people. It was the feeling of being forgotten, of knowing that the world outside had moved on, leaving them with nothing but crumbs. So, when we ask, what did medieval prisoners eat? The answer isn't just about bread and ale. It's about inequality. It's about cruelty disguised as practicality. And it's about the strange way humans cling to routine, even in chains. Because whether you were a starving thief, a captured knight feasting in his chamber, or a half-forgotten debtor scribbling letters for cheese, your meals defined the rhythm of your captivity. And with that, we can gently close the dungeon door for now. Let's drift up the stone steps, leaving behind the echo of chewing jaws and the thin smell of sour beer. There are more quiet corners of history waiting, and in the next part, we'll wander somewhere else, just as peculiar. All right, we've climbed back up from the dungeons now. The stale bread, the sour ale, and the dim candlelight can fade for a while. So let's stretch out a little in more comfortable surroundings. We're drifting back into the upper chambers of palaces, where the food was richer, the tapestries warmer, and yet the behavior was often far less dignified. Because now we're talking about royalty at their pettiest. Kings and queens who had the power to shape nations, but often used their energy on sulks, grudges, and tantrums. Which, if you think about it, is very human. Just a little louder, and backed by swords. So settle in. Let's wander gently through some of the most dysfunctional royal habits. Softly, of course. Because this is a lullaby of pettiness. Let's begin with Charles VI of France. We met him briefly before, when he thought he was made of glass. But his reign was an entire opera of dysfunction. Imagine being the ruler of France, yet insisting your courtiers avoid touching you in case you shattered like a goblet. He wrapped himself in blankets, shuffled around, and even designed special clothes padded to keep him safe. Court life, as you might guess, was awkward. Every gesture had to be cautious, no sudden movements, because the king might believe he'd splinter into shards at any moment. Of course, the irony is that his courtiers were terrified of shattering their own positions, so they played along. They bowed to the glass king, they whispered carefully around him, and France stumbled through crises while the monarch lived in a fragile dream. Then there's Peter the Great of Russia. Peter, as you might know, had a talent for modernization. He also had a fascination with dentistry. Not in the sense of funding medical schools, no. He liked to personally extract teeth. Voluntarily, if you were lucky, but sometimes not. He carried pliers, and he carried his collection, a small box of extracted teeth, which he displayed proudly like trophies. Visiting the most powerful man in Russia could mean returning home with one less molar. Imagine the tension of every smile in the court. Was it admiration? Or was Peter eyeing up his next contribution? It's the kind of hobby that makes you grateful for modern etiquette. Now, let's drift to England for a moment. James II, a monarch with a short fuse. One day, a servant handed him a pair of boots slightly the wrong size. James erupted, the kind of rage that shakes a palace. Days of trembling staff, all because of ill-fitting footwear. And yet, this was a king who made decisions on matters of state. Boots, treaties, apparently the same level of importance in his mind. Elizabeth I, meanwhile, one of the most commanding rulers of her age, was known to slap her ladies-in-waiting when annoyed. It's the sort of detail that doesn't make it into the romantic portraits. The high collars, the pearls, the symbolism of empire. But behind closed doors, she was fully capable of hurling objects or delivering a sharp cuff. And of course, everyone smiled and called her majestic. Because what else can you do when your employer also commands armies? Louis XIV of France, the so-called Sun King, turned his mornings into theater. Every stretch, every yawn, every wig adjustment, all performed before an audience of courtiers. It was called the Levee, the Royal Rising, a performance of power wrapped in satin sheets. If he was grumpy, then the whole court had to tiptoe through his irritation. Imagine waking up in a bad mood with 30 dozen nobles watching. A spectacle, yes, but also exhausting. For everyone. His cousin across the channel, Charles II of England, had his own peculiarities. Charles adored his dogs, especially a breed that became known as the King Charles Spaniel. They roamed the palace freely, sometimes even during state meetings, which meant that ambassadors discussing trade deals occasionally had a small dog climbing onto their lap. Policies decided with a paw on your knee. A charming image, unless you were trying to focus on avoiding war.
Food, of course, was another stage for royal quirks. Some kings demanded trumpets before the first bite. Others insisted on dishes from far-off lands, even if it meant the food arrived spoiled. No one dared complain. If the king wanted cold, wormy eel from 3 countries away, then cold, wormy eel was what the court applauded. The ritual mattered more than the reality. One ruler, Frederick William I of Prussia, developed a fixation on tall soldiers. He built what was essentially a human collection, the Potsdam Giants. Men selected purely for their height, fed, drilled, and paraded as if they were rare birds. And when the supply of tall men ran low, he resorted to bribing, kidnapping, or breeding them, because naturally the solution to military strategy was to create a private display of unusually tall guards. The kingdom groaned under his obsessions, while he beamed with satisfaction at his lineup of human towers. It wasn't always cruelty, though. Sometimes it was just absurd levels of boredom. Royalty had endless leisure, and leisure turned strange. We hear of monarchs staging elaborate games, sulking when courtiers lost on purpose, or throwing tantrums when anyone dared win. When your word is law, losing becomes unthinkable, so the games became theater, which, unsurprisingly, wasn't very fun for anyone involved. And then there were the grudges. One king nearly went to war because another monarch didn't use the right honorific in a letter. Another threatened an envoy's life because his dog barked during a ceremony. Diplomacy, in short, was often a battle of egos, disguised in Latin, and occasionally those egos turned into actual battles. So why linger on these meltdowns? Because they remind us how fragile power really was. Behind the crowns and the pageantry, these were people raised in nurseries where every whim was indulged. Every cough sparked panic. Every temper was soothed with jewels. And when those children grew into rulers, their habits scaled up with them. The toddler who screamed over spilled honey became the monarch who slapped courtiers. The lonely boy drilled in Latin became the man staging his yawns for a nation. The fragile heir, swaddled in charms, became the king who feared his body was made of glass. It's both ridiculous and strangely human. Loneliness, boredom, insecurity, all magnified by velvet and jewels, all mistaken for policy. So tonight we can let those royal tantrums drift into the background. The slammed goblets, the barking dogs, the oversized boots, little storms in palaces that changed nothing, and yet somehow everything. And softly we'll move forward, because there's another odd corner of history waiting. Not in the tantrums of rulers, but in the clothes they left behind. So, we've wandered past the dungeons, brushed past the tantrums, and now we find ourselves in an altogether quieter place. Not the echoing throne room, not the battlefield, not even the bedroom where kings sulked about boots, but the wardrobe. Because royal clothing, as ridiculous as it sometimes looked, has stories of its own. Silks and velvets didn't just hang idly on racks. They were tools of power, symbols of ego, and sometimes
after their royal owners died, they took on lives stranger than the people who wore them. So, let's gently tug at a sleeve and drift through the peculiar history of royal wardrobes. The first thing to understand is that medieval and early modern clothes were staggeringly expensive. Not just a few coins, we're talking fortunes. A single cloak might represent months of income for an entire town. Gold thread was not poetic metaphor, it was literal, woven into fabric, shimmering in candlelight, announcing status louder than a trumpet. This meant that clothing was an investment. Kings and queens listed gowns, stockings, and gloves in their wills right alongside castles and jewels. Imagine leaving your favorite socks as a bequest to some minor cousin. That's how valuable they were. Not because of the socks themselves, but because of what they signified, proximity to the royal body. Take Elizabeth I again. She was famously meticulous about her wardrobe. By the end of her reign, she owned thousands of gowns, layers of silks, embroidery, pearls, stitched into patterns so heavy that standing upright must have felt like balancing under a chandelier. And after she died, those clothes became treasures in their own right. Some were gifted, some recycled, and some quietly disappeared into the hands of servants who were probably far too delighted to leave any record of their inheritance. But a few pieces survived, and what's striking is how ordinary they look now. Faded silks, worn embroidery, the shimmer gone. Just fragile fabric that once touched power. It's like seeing the ghost of someone in the outline of their sleeve. Other royal wardrobes met stranger fates. Take Henry VIII. The king who tore England from the Pope also had a soft spot for flamboyant fashion. Feathers, slashed sleeves, vast codpieces. His wardrobe was a carnival of ego. But after his death, much of it was dismantled, cut apart, restitched, sold off. Because nothing ages faster than yesterday's fashion, even if yesterday's fashion once belonged to a monarch. Some of Henry's clothes were given to servants, who wore them until they disintegrated, which is an image worth pausing on. A palace butler trudging around in what was once the king's favorite feathered tunic. The garment transformed from symbol of supremacy to something that smelled faintly of kitchen smoke.
Clothes could also become political. Mary, Queen of Scots, left a carefully chosen wardrobe when she walked to her execution. She dressed in red, the color of Catholic martyrdom, ensuring her death was as much a performance as her life. The gown itself became a relic. Scraps of fabric were treasured by sympathizers, fragments stitched into devotional books, hidden in purses, cherished like holy relics. The woman was gone, the fabric lived on. Sometimes, clothes were deliberately destroyed. In revolutions, wardrobes were looted as symbols of tyranny. Silks hacked apart, shoes burned, gloves tossed into the street. The idea was simple. If you erase the clothes, you erase the aura. But of course, it never quite worked, because you can burn a robe, but you can't unsee the image of someone once draped in it. During the French Revolution, Marie Antoinette's gowns became symbols of everything the crowd despised. Her towering hairpieces, her imported fabrics, her shimmering jewels sewn into cloth. And yet, the same revolutionaries who mocked her excesses eagerly tried on her cast-offs, because disgust and fascination are never far apart, and silk, even hated silk, feels too soft to resist.
And then there's the odd case of clothing as medicine. Yes, medicine. In some traditions, garments worn by kings were believed to hold healing power. A sick child might be wrapped in a king's shirt, a headache eased by laying a royal glove on the brow. Because royalty wasn't just about politics, it was about bodies infused with divine authority. And if the body had power, so did the laundry. Of course, one wonders how hygienic these practices really were, especially considering how rarely some monarchs changed their clothes. But belief is stronger than soap. And for centuries, people clung to the idea that a stained sleeve might cure them. Wardrobes could also expose vulnerabilities. When Charles II of Spain died, a man so inbred he could barely chew, his clothes were catalogued. The record is grim. Tiny garments for a stunted body, corsets to hold him upright, shoes designed more for support than walking. Through his wardrobe, you glimpse the physical toll of centuries of dynastic marriages. His body was frail, and his clothes became silent evidence of a dynasty's collapse.
We also find comedy in the wardrobes. For example, the obsession with sumptuary laws, rules about who could wear what. Purple for royals, certain furs only for nobility. The idea was to keep everyone in their place by stitching hierarchy into cloth. Naturally, people ignored these rules constantly. Merchants wore silks, clerks sneaked in colored shoes, and kings grumbled while issuing new laws that were just as ineffective. It's rather comforting, actually. Fashion policing failed as badly in the 1500s as it does today. And then there's the simple passage of time. The royal robe that dazzled in 1450 might look absurd in 1550. Sleeves ballooned, collars grew into wings, shoes stretched into points so long they had to be tied to the knee. Each generation mocked the last while looking equally ridiculous themselves. And through it all, tailors smiled and collected their fees. Some garments were preserved deliberately, coronation robes, for instance. Heavy velvet cloaks embroidered with symbols of authority. They were worn only on a few occasions, then carefully folded away. They remind us how much ceremony relied on fabric. Because what is a coronation really without a shiny cloak to frame the crown? It's theater, and costumes are everything in theater.
So, when we look back at these wardrobes, we're not just looking at fashion. We're looking at politics, vanity, fear, and memory stitched into cloth. A gown could declare war. A cloak could signal faith. A codpiece could express more insecurity than any diary ever written. And when those rulers vanished, their clothes sometimes carried the story forward, cut into relics, looted in anger, worn until threadbare, or tucked away in dusty archives, waiting centuries to whisper their secrets again. So, tonight, as you settle deeper under your own blanket, imagine those royal fabrics, the scratch of wool, the weight of velvet, the shimmer of silk in candlelight. Once symbols of power, now fragile threads in museums. Proof that even kings and queens were, in the end, just people trying to look impressive, and occasionally failing spectacularly. And softly, let's drift onward, because our next stop is not fabric, but flesh. The bodies of royal children, sickly, spoiled, and often heartbreakingly fragile. Tiny heirs, wrapped in swaddling, destined for crowns, but often destined for something far less glorious.
So, we've slipped past the prisons and the wardrobes, and now we find ourselves in a quieter, though no less curious corner of history, the royal nursery. Because while it's easy to imagine kings and queens as towering, glittering figures, perched on thrones, draped in jewels, most of them, at one point, were very small, very fragile, and frankly, often quite miserable. The truth is that royal childhoods were rarely golden. They were more like gilded cages, shiny on the outside, lonely and damp on the inside. So tonight, let's step softly into the nursery and peek at the strange, spoiled, and often sad world of royal children. First, let's talk about survival. For all the silks, for all the physicians, for all the prayers, being born royal did not protect you from the fragility of childhood. In fact, many dynasties resembled more of a medical drama than a family tree. Take the children of Catherine de' Medici. She gave birth to 10. 10! Out of those, only a handful made it to adulthood. And even then, they stumbled through life with sickly constitutions, weak jaws, and a general air of, "Please don't breathe too hard near me." One son, Charles IX, was so prone to fits of hysteria and illness that he looked less like a monarch and more like a fragile porcelain doll someone forgot to wrap properly. It's a recurring theme. So many royal heirs entered the world with fanfare, only to exit quietly a few years later, wrapped in shrouds rather than coronation robes. And with each tiny funeral, the court had to smile through tears and immediately start praying for the next one.
Of course, the ones who did survive were spoiled. How could they not be? An entire household revolved around their comfort. Nurses, tutors, servants, physicians, all orbiting a small child like planets around a sun. If the child sneezed, half a dozen adults rushed in with cloths, herbs, and anxious bows. But that didn't always produce happy children. Instead, it often produced small tyrants, children who screamed for toys made of gold, demanded servants be whipped for looking at them incorrectly, and occasionally bit courtiers just to see if they'd get away with it. Spoiled children in ordinary households might break a plate. Spoiled royal children might plunge kingdoms into war. Henry VIII himself, in childhood, was described as merry and handsome, but also prone to sulks that could darken entire rooms. As an adult, those sulks grew into executions. So, really, you could trace a direct line from the grumpy royal toddler refusing vegetables to the middle-aged king beheading wives. A chilling sort of continuity. And yet, some spoiled children remained oddly pathetic figures. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, was raised in such opulent coddling that he became convinced of his absolute centrality to the universe, which, in fairness, was exactly what his tutors told him. He was taught to view courtiers as props, wars as amusements, and himself as the axis of God's plan. By adulthood, this childlike self-importance hardened into monarchy as theater. Versailles itself was essentially a giant playhouse for a spoiled child who never quite grew up. But beyond the tantrums, there was the loneliness. Royal children were rarely raised by their parents. Kings and queens had kingdoms to mismanage. Children were handed to wet nurses, governesses, and tutors, often not seeing their parents for weeks or months. And when they did, the encounters were stiff, ceremonial, and sometimes terrifying. Imagine being 4 years old, led into a grand hall, and told to bow before a jeweled stranger you are informed is your mother. It's no wonder many of these children grew up emotionally distant, awkward,
or simply baffled by human connection. And then there was the pressure. From the moment of birth, royal children were less children and more dynastic insurance policies. Your body was not your own. It belonged to the family line. You were a vessel for alliances, inheritances, and hopes of stability. If you were a boy, you were the crown's continuation. If you were a girl, you were a bargaining chip, traded in marriage like a jeweled pawn on the political chessboard. Little wonder so many children cracked under that pressure, or turned cruel, because cruelty was the only power they actually controlled. The illnesses also tell their own story. Porphyria, rickets, tuberculosis, smallpox. These weren't distant threats. They were constant companions. Prince Arthur, elder brother of Henry VIII, died young of a fever, leaving the crown to his brother, which, in hindsight, did not turn out splendidly for anyone involved. Charles II of Spain is the poster child for sickly royal childhoods. Born so weak he struggled to feed himself, he grew into a man with a face described not kindly as grotesque. His jaw jutted, his body sagged, his health failed constantly. He was the result of centuries of inbreeding, a living reminder that dynastic obsession with bloodlines could undo itself spectacularly. In childhood, courtiers described him as more doll than child, an eerie phrase, but not inaccurate. There's also a macabre detail. Toys. Royal toys weren't wooden horses or rag dolls. They were often miniature weapons, tiny suits of armor, child-sized swords, little fortresses to practice sieges. Because childhood wasn't about play, it was about training for power. Even in the nursery, the shadow of war loomed. Some princes were paraded in armor before they could walk properly. Imagine wobbling around in a helmet while still in diapers. It's funny, and also a little heartbreaking.
But not all royal children were warriors in training. Some leaned toward the arts. A young Mary, Queen of Scots, learned embroidery and music while essentially imprisoned in other people's castles. Elizabeth I spent much of her youth under suspicion, with her life hanging by a thread, and retreated into study. Her tutors taught her Latin, Greek, French, Italian. Knowledge became her armor, a way to survive a childhood that must have felt like walking on cracked ice. It's striking how often royal children learned to adapt by becoming sharp observers. When you're small, powerless, and surrounded by adults who could kill you, paying attention becomes a survival skill. And some of those children, like Elizabeth, turned that skill into remarkable reigns. Still, for every strong survivor, there were dozens who faltered. Children who wasted away in damp nurseries. Children who became paranoid, cruel, or broken by pressure. Children remembered only as short lines in dynastic charts, died young. Their stories remind us of the irony. These were the children surrounded by more luxury than anyone else alive. And yet their lives were fragile, lonely, and often sadder than those of the peasants they were taught to rule. So, as you sink deeper into your pillow, imagine those royal nurseries, the smell of wax candles, the rustle of nurses' gowns, the tiny thrones for tiny heirs, gilded and uncomfortable, the soft cough of a child that might decide the fate of kingdoms. It's a sobering reminder that power doesn't shield you from fragility, that kings and queens, before they were symbols, were once just children, spoiled, sickly, lonely, and often deeply human. And gently, let's drift onward, because our next stop lies beyond childhood,
into the world of tantrums grown large, the strange habits and petty meltdowns of monarchs who should have known better, but very rarely did.
So, we've seen them as children, sickly, spoiled, lonely, and perhaps it's no surprise that when those children grew up and inherited kingdoms, they carried those habits with them. Except now, instead of wooden toys and tiny tantrums, their whims had armies, courtiers, and entire nations attached. Royalty was, in many ways, a lifelong stage play, and the adult actors often leaned a little too heavily into the melodrama. Let's begin with Charles VI of France. He was known as Charles the Mad. Not exactly a flattering nickname, but also not inaccurate. Charles suffered frequent breakdowns. In one infamous period, he became convinced that his body was made of glass. Yes, glass. He believed he would shatter if anyone touched him. So he wrapped himself in blankets, avoided sudden movements, and forbade contact. Imagine the royal court, tiptoeing around a king who demanded the same caution one gives to a delicate wine goblet. It sounds absurd, almost comic, but for those who lived through it, it must have been tense, surreal, and exhausting. Of course, courtiers had no choice but to play along, because when your employer is the king, fragile or not, you don't correct him. You nod. You bow. And you act as if glass bones are simply another divine mystery. Now, let's glide northward to Russia, to Peter the Great. Peter had a curious hobby. He liked dentistry, which sounds innocent enough until you remember that dentistry in the 17th century was not a gentle art. Peter carried pliers, and he pulled teeth. His friends' teeth. His courtiers' teeth. Sometimes teeth of strangers he encountered. Voluntary or not. He even kept the extracted teeth in a collection, like trophies, displayed them with pride. Imagine visiting the Tsar, only for him to smile, reach for his pliers, and say, "Open wide." For Peter, this was entertainment. For everyone else, let's just say it wasn't the highlight of their day. And then we have the meltdowns, the royal temper tantrums. When you grow up being told your every whim is sacred, your patience does not improve with age. King James II of England once erupted into a fury because a servant handed him boots that were slightly the wrong size. Not grotesquely wrong, not from the wrong season, just slightly too small. The outburst was so violent that the entire household remained uneasy for days. Because if this was how the king responded to boots, what might he do if you handed him, say, the wrong cup of wine? Elizabeth I, brilliant though she was, also had her moments. She had been shaped by a childhood of suspicion and danger, so perhaps it's understandable that she developed a sharp temper. Still, she was known to slap her ladies-in-waiting when they annoyed her. Not exactly the image of the serene virgin queen, glowing in her ruff and jewels. But then, monarchs were rarely serene in private. They were human, which, unfortunately for their servants, meant they were also petty. Some eccentricities were less violent, more theatrical. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. He enjoyed being watched. In fact, he staged his waking up as a performance. Every morning, courtiers assembled to witness him rise, the stretching, the yawning, the wig placed carefully upon his head. It was called the lever, or rising,
an event, not just a routine. The king's morning grogginess became a national spectacle, and courtiers scrambled to be included because being near the royal yawn could mean advancement, a theater of power. Or perhaps just a spoiled child who never quite outgrew needing an audience. Food rituals were another source of oddity. Some monarchs demanded trumpets to be played before they took the first bite. Others insisted their meals include delicacies imported from distant lands, even if the food arrived weeks old, cold, or slightly crawling with insects. And no one dared complain. If a royal wanted half-rotten eel, then rotten eel was served with a flourish. The cooks could not refuse, because in royal kitchens, taste mattered far less than obedience.
Politics, too, often became personal tantrums with crowns attached. One king nearly launched a war because another monarch failed to use the proper honorific in a letter. Another threatened to execute a diplomat because his dog barked during a ceremony. This was the fragile line between governance and childish impulse. Royal dignity could be as brittle as Charles VI's imagined glass bones. It's tempting to laugh, to see these figures as absurd. Kings who sulked, queens who slapped, czars who pulled teeth. But there's a melancholy undercurrent, too. Because when you grow up in nurseries where every cough sparks panic, when every whim is indulged, when no one ever tells you no, you become trapped in your own theater, unable to grow, unable to see the world outside yourself. The spoiled child becomes the petty monarch. The lonely heir becomes the eccentric ruler. The fragile boy becomes the king convinced he is made of glass. So, as we drift here in the quiet, let's soften the laughter into something gentler. Because these strange habits and meltdowns weren't only absurdities. They were symptoms of isolation, of fragility, of being told from birth that your every thought mattered more than anyone else's. And when the crown was placed upon their heads, those thoughts became law. Now, let's dim the candlelight a little further, because the tantrums and odd hobbies are only part of the story. What happens when the crown slips away entirely? When kings and queens leave not just their thrones, but their bodies behind? That's where we're drifting next, to the curious, unsettling afterlives of royal remains.
We've walked through childhoods. We've tiptoed past tantrums. We've watched monarchs who thought they were glass or who collected teeth. But every king, every queen, every prince and princess ended the same way. No matter how gilded the cradle, no matter how heavy the crown, all of them met the quiet hush of death. And yet, royalty never quite belonged to themselves. Not in life, not in death. Because when a king dies, his body isn't just a body. It's a symbol, a relic, a stage prop for power. Which means, more often than not, their afterlives took strange, unsettling turns. Take William the Conqueror, a man remembered as a giant of history, the Norman who reshaped England in 1066. But his death? Far from majestic. William grew, let's say, stout in later years. And when he died, his body swelled further, so much so that when they tried to place him in his coffin, it didn't fit. The attendants forced the lid shut, and when they pressed too hard, the corpse burst. A stench so terrible filled the church that the mourners fled. The funeral of the great conqueror dissolved into chaos. Not solemn hymns, not dignified prayers, just people running for fresh air, gagging, while the king's body lay ruined.
Royal remains were often political tools. Oliver Cromwell, though not a king, ruled England as Lord Protector. When the monarchy returned, the new regime decided Cromwell did not deserve rest. So they dug him up, hung his corpse, beheaded it, and placed the skull on display outside Westminster. For decades, centuries even, his head traveled, from owners to collectors to secret stashes, until eventually it ended up buried quietly at Cambridge University. A man who had defied kings, reduced to a curiosity passed around like an antique coin. Kings could not even guarantee peace inside their tombs. Consider Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. When revolutionaries stormed Paris, they opened the royal tombs at Saint-Denis. Bodies were dragged out, bones scattered. Monarchs who had once been worshipped as near divine were tossed into pits. Imagine the silence of the crypt broken by the shouts of men in rags hauling out gilded coffins, prying them open with crowbars. The smell of rot, the tattered remains of once immaculate clothing, and the skull of a Sun King staring blankly at the Paris mob.
Sometimes kings' remains were treated like relics. Richard the Lionheart had his body buried in one place, his heart in another, and his entrails in yet another. It was as if, even in death, his legend had to be divided, spread across the land like pieces of a saint. A medieval form of branding ensuring that pilgrims and subjects alike could venerate fragments of the great warrior king. His heart, by the way, was analyzed centuries later. Turns out it had been embalmed with mercury, frankincense, and lime. Less divine magic, more chemistry experiment. Other monarchs were simply misplaced. Henry I of England, son of William the Conqueror, was buried at Reading Abbey. Except, Reading Abbey no longer exists. It was destroyed during the Reformation. No one knows exactly where Henry's body is now. Somewhere beneath the modern town of Reading lies the bones of a king. Paved over, forgotten. Perhaps under a parking lot, perhaps beneath someone's garden. The king who once ruled vast lands may now rest beneath a grocery store aisle. And then there are the rumors, the whispers of incorruptible corpses. Some claimed that when certain monarchs were exhumed, their bodies had not decayed, a sign, people believed, of divine favor, of holiness. But science, when it peeked behind the curtain, often discovered more practical explanations. A well-sealed coffin, unusual soil chemistry, the use of lead, wax, or strange embalming mixtures. But still, the image of a king or queen lying untouched centuries later is haunting, as if the performance of monarchy refused to end, even in the grave.
And sometimes royal bodies caused trouble long after death. Alexander the Great wasn't technically a medieval king, but his story lingers. When he died, his body became a prize, stolen, fought over, carried to Egypt. It was said to remain on display for centuries, glass coffin, still visible, still worshipped, until one day it vanished, lost to history. Kings wanted to be remembered, but sometimes memory slips away. Even the mightiest conqueror can be misplaced, like a misfiled document. It wasn't only monarchs. Royal children, too, had peculiar afterlives. The princes in the Tower, Edward V and his brother Richard, supposedly murdered in the 15th century, their bones may or may not have been discovered beneath a staircase in the Tower of London centuries later, but the mystery remains unsolved. The afterlife of their bodies became a kind of riddle, a national ghost story. Their tiny skeletons, if they were truly theirs, turned into symbols of betrayal and power gains. So, what can we say about all this? That kings and queens never truly belonged to themselves, not in life, not in death. Their bodies were stage props, weapons, relics, curiosities. Even their bones were forced into the theater of power, displayed, stolen, desecrated, worshipped, anything except quietly laid to rest. And now, as the candle burns lower, we can close this chapter with a simple truth. The crowns fell, the thrones cracked, the kingdoms shifted, but the remains of those who ruled linger on, sometimes in tombs, sometimes in pits, sometimes beneath shopping centers, hidden beneath the footprints of ordinary life, silent, fragmented, and yet never entirely gone.
So here we are. We've wandered through royal nurseries, banquet halls, gloomy prisons, and even the crypts. We've seen kings tantrum like children. We've seen children treated like miniature kings. We've watched monarchs burst at their funerals, beheaded long after burial, or misplaced under modern parking lots. And the question that lingers is, why do we care? Why does the odd, tedious, sometimes downright ridiculous private life of royalty still pull us in centuries later? Part of it is the contrast. We imagine kings and queens as larger than life, crowned, jeweled, untouchable. So when we discover that a monarch once threw a fit because his dinner wasn't warm enough, or because someone else's cloak looked better in candlelight, it feels oddly human. It's like peeking behind the velvet curtain and finding not a godlike figure, but a very grumpy man who stubbed his toe. It makes history familiar. Not heroic statues, but flawed people in elaborate costumes. But it's also the other side of the contrast, because these petty, fragile humans had such enormous consequences. A spoiled child on the throne could plunge a country into war. A sickly prince could collapse an entire dynasty. A king's obsession with heirs could rewrite religious life across an empire. Tiny, almost comical flaws ripple outward into centuries of blood and politics. That's both terrifying and darkly funny. Imagine if your least functional coworker suddenly had the power to start wars and change the church calendar. That, in essence, was monarchy.
And then there's the morbid curiosity. Royal lives ended dramatically and often undignified. A burst corpse here, a desecrated tomb there, a missing skeleton tucked beneath a staircase. Even in their deaths, they were public property. People needed to see them, display them, argue about them. And we, centuries later, still peer into those coffins, still analyze the bones, still speculate about lost graves. In some way, their afterlives are more fascinating than their actual lives. But perhaps the strongest reason we're drawn to them is that they're both alien and familiar. A medieval king in a jewel-crusted robe seems impossibly far from us, and yet his diary might read like anyone else's on a bad day. My stomach hurts, the servants are lazy, everyone is annoying.
A queen might write letters about loneliness, jealousy, or a sibling who wouldn't stop talking. Timeless complaints wrapped in silk and gold. So while they ruled castles, and we mostly rule microwaves, the emotions overlap, which is oddly comforting. Of course, the darker side of that is how fragile power really was. A dynasty could crumble because of a single sick child. A throne could topple because a king married the wrong cousin. An empire could burn because someone decided to raise taxes on salt. History turns on details so small they feel almost absurd. But absurdity is the heart of human life, isn't it?
And what about the royals themselves? Did they ever feel the weight of absurdity? Did they ever look around the banquet table, sigh, and think, "This is all a bit much, isn't it?" Probably not. Most were too busy believing they were chosen by God. But occasionally you find hints. A weary note in a king's letter, a joke scribbled in a monk's margin, a queen sigh about endless ceremonies, brief cracks in the gold plating, fleeting glimpses of the people inside. So what lingers for us now, centuries later, is not the grandeur, not the battles, not the endless treaties and tax reforms, but the peculiar, the personal, the fragments that make history feel alive. That a mighty conqueror burst in his coffin, that a queen wept over a ruined hairstyle, that a prince collected teeth like seashells. Tiny details that stick long after the great battles are forgotten. And maybe that's what keeps us awake at night, or, in this case, gently drifts us towards sleep. Because in the end, history is not kings or wars or castles. It's people. Flawed, fragile, peculiar people, wearing crowns that were far too heavy for their necks. And if they could stumble, tantrum, and embarrass themselves so thoroughly, then maybe our own mistakes aren't so catastrophic after all.
So, as the candle gutters out and the last page turns, we can leave the kings and queens where they belong. Some in tombs, some in stories, some beneath supermarkets and streets. Silent now, but never quite forgotten. And with that, I'll let you rest. If you've made it this far, thank you for drifting along with me. If you genuinely enjoy these sleepy wanderings through history, consider subscribing, liking the video, or leaving a quiet comment. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Tell me if you fell asleep halfway, or if you stayed wide awake to the end. Either way, good night. And may your dreams be a little less strange than those of kings and queens.